Hi, my name is Anna Heck. I'm an apiculture extension educator at Michigan State University, and I'm going to talk on beekeeping ordinances and selecting a site for your apiary. So the first thing you'll want to do when you're considering a location for your apiary or your bee yard is to check with your city about beekeeping ordinances. If there is a written ordinance, it might permit or prohibit beekeeping. It might require setbacks, so it might require a certain distance between the bee yard and the property line, for example. It might limit the number of colonies. Sometimes this limitation is based off of lot size. It might include other requirements. Some of the beekeeping ordinances are pretty detailed and will have requirements related to management and other equipment. It might require permission from your neighbors. So really the best way to figure out if beekeeping is allowed is to contact your city. You can sometimes search through city codes online. And if you do this, you'll want to consider several different search terms. So honeybee as one word or as two words, apiculture, beekeeping, stinging insects. But to be sure, I'd suggest just checking directly with your city. If there's not anything written on beekeeping from your city, then whether or not it's allowed depends on the city's interpretation. So I've talked with some cities that will say, if there's nothing written on beekeeping, that means it's allowed. I've talked with other cities that will say if beekeeping isn't expressly allowed through ordinances, then that means it's prohibited. So really you should check with your city about whether or not beekeeping is allowed. And beekeeping may fall under other laws or ordinances. One big one might be public nuisance. So even if you're allowed to keep bees and there's not a lot of restrictions, if you're creating a public nuisance, you may be subject to that ordinance. And one big point is to not limit yourself just to thinking about your own location. So many beekeepers who manage several colonies will have multiple bee yards, and we'll find these bee yards through, friends of family, people that buy our honey. There's a lot of times people who are interested in having honeybee colonies or hives on their property, but not interested in managing them. Sometimes these connections are made online through different forums. So consider other locations as well. So don't limit yourself to just your home location if that's not going to be a suitable or appropriate place to keep bees. There are many different ordinances out there. If your city doesn't have an ordinance, they might be interested in considering ordinances. Oftentimes they might look at nearby cities. The Minnesota Hobby Beekeepers Association has a sample ordinance that can be changed and adopted. So that's one example as well. And so when you're selecting your bee yard, the main things to consider are the safety for you as the beekeeper and for people and animals nearby. So you want space to work in split colonies. The hives equipment and the boxes full of honey can be really awkward and difficult to lift and carry. They're oftentimes sticky and heavy, and they're full of bees. And so you want to be in a place where you have, good footing, where you have space to move around. If you are splitting colonies, then you will want space to expand your apiary. You want your yard to be away from pedestrian traffic. You don't want it to be right next to a walking path or a sidewalk. It can be really helpful for many beekeepers to have vehicle accessibility to their bee yards. So again, these boxes can be really heavy. We're oftentimes carrying heavy, bulky equipment to and from the bee yard. So having your bee yard in a place where you can drive right up to it can be helpful. If you are in a location with bears, you'll want to consider an electric fence. Bears will feed on developing brood. And once they find a bee yard, they'll oftentimes keep returning to that yard. So really what you want to do is prevent the bear from ever getting into the hives, and that's often known with an electric fence. And then finally, you'll want to consider a water source. So this can be something natural, or it can be a water that you set out for your bees. You can put it close to your hives, and you want to keep it full with water. Especially in urban areas, oftentimes honeybees will collect water from swimming pools, bird baths, faucets, hoses, and a lot of times we'll hear complaints from neighbors who don't appreciate hundreds of bees visiting their location. And so what we want to do is set up a water source early in the season. Bees will oftentimes return to the same water source, and if you keep it close to the hives, that can help reduce the chances that your bees are going to fly further away to your neighbors for water. All right. There's some other things to consider in terms of the bees, but really I mostly focus on what is a good location for the beekeeper. So what is going to be a safe, easy, convenient space to work. But in terms of the bees, sometimes sun can help, having the hives in the sun, but that's not a deal breaker. I've kept some bees in some shady locations that do really well. You want to avoid spaces that are in a depression where there's a lot of moisture that builds up. If you're in a place that's very windy, you can consider a windbreak. So that might be a tree line, or that might be something that you construct and put at the edge of your bee yard. You want to be in a place where there's nectar and pollen available, a couple miles. And sometimes it can take having honeybees in a location for several years to really gauge the forage in the area. Sometimes places that don't look like they'd be good for bees end up being great because the bees just find a lot of forage in the roadsides or maybe in nearby trees, but it can sometimes be a little bit tricky to know exactly how good or bad a location is going to be for forage without having bees in for a little while. And then again, a level area. So you want your a space where the hives aren't going to be on soft ground where they might tip, and you want it also to be a space that's easy for you to work. All right, so I'll show you here a few photos of different bee yards. This is a photo with bees on the edge of a cornfield. And a lot of times beekeepers might assume this wouldn't be a great spot for bees. And I'll tell you that the bees in this location did really well. So even though corn is wind pollinated and bees won't visit corn, if there's other good forage around, the bees were able to find lots of good forage in this area, roadsides, flowering weeds. And so even though they were right on the edge of the cornfield, they did really well. This is a rooftop apiary. So rooftop apiaries can be appealing because they keep the bee flight traffic up higher, and especially in urban places where space is limited, that can be appealing. But a few things to consider. One is that the hives can be hundreds of pounds. They can be really heavy, and then you have people on the roof too, so you want to make sure that your roof can support that weight. Another thing to consider is that we'd be moving big, heavy, sometimes sticky equipment up and down. So if you're able to do that in a safe manner. And then finally, if you need to go inside a building in order to access the rooftop, it can be very challenging to leave a bee yard without having some bees on you or following you. So that is another point to consider. This is a photo where the owner used some wooden boards to create a windbreak to protect the hives from really big gusts of winds throughout the winter. These hives, as you can see, are in shade, and they're also very tall. So these bees colonies did really well. They were great honey producing colonies, even though they were in partial shade. So just because the location has some shade doesn't necessarily mean that it won't be a good spot for bees. And this is a yard that was a little bit cramped. We kept splitting colonies and adding colonies, and that meant that sometimes we didn't always have exactly enough space to work the hives. So when we're working hives, we want spaces to set stacks of boxes next to us. And so as you're planning for your apiary, ideally you want to consider how much space you'd want if you want to expand your apiary, if you want to split colonies or add hives. All right, thank you very much. Good luck finding a spot for your bees.